Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning or good evening for those connecting from other time zones. Thank you for joining us in a new edition of the webinar series hosted by EU DisinfoLab. My name is Raquel Miguel, and I'm part of the research team. As you might know, we are a non-profit organization gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe, and we regularly host webinars in order to give voice to the best experts in the field and to stay up to date on research, policy, and responses to disinformation. So welcome to our webinar today that we have titled Generative AI and Disinformation, a Legal Perspective. As we know, the impact of AI on the information ecosystem has been making headlines, especially during this critical year for elections worldwide. Today, we will take a little break from the US elections, but we will focus on one of the threats that have been seen in that election as well as in others. We will discuss how AI has been leveraged to produce disinformation, and especially how can it be addressed in the existing legal frameworks. And that is why we are counting on one of the biggest experts in the field, Noémie Krack. Noémie, welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation. But before introducing our guest speaker properly, let me mention a few housekeeping rules that may already sound familiar to many of you. First, this session is being recorded and the playback will be available shortly on our YouTube channel. And second, for communication purposes and for the Q&A session, we will be using Slido, an app which you can open on your phone by scanning the QR code you currently see on the screen, or by typing in your web browser slido.com, and when requested, adding the hashtag disinfo. Let's get some audience interaction by inviting you to answer 2 questions. Please let us know where you are joining us from today and which sector you represent. Quick reminder for the latecomers, slido.com, hashtag disinfo. I'll give you a minute, and in the meantime, let me tell you that we are very happy to resume our webinars after a small gap. We were quite busy with an in-person event, our annual conference in Riga. If you were there, happy to connect again, and if not, don't miss the opportunity next year. Okay, let's have a look at the answers now. A lot of people from Brussels, welcome. Scotland, Hasselt, Germany, Paris, Madrid, Singapore, London, Berlin, Lisbon, Glasgow. Yeah, we have people from many continents, some parts of the world. So yeah, really welcome. So let's have a look at the sectors that you represent and you work on. Okay, you haven't answered yet. I'd give you a minute. Majority of people coming from non-governmental organizations, but also academia and media, other sectors as well. We have almost all them covered. That's great. And yeah, now that you're familiar with Slido, don't wait until the end to submit your questions. You can write them and send them whenever you like during the presentation, and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A sessions. And without further delay, I am pleased to introduce Noémie Krack. She's a researcher at the Center for Information Technologies and Intellectual Property Law at the Catholic University Leuven, where she provides guest lectures on media law. Her research focuses on media law, artificial intelligence, and the challenges that technology raises for fundamental rights. She has been working on several European Union interdisciplinary projects on technology and media, including iGame, AI4Media, and Media Futures. She's also an editorial board member of the European AI Media Observatory. As you can see, she is a leading voice to talk about the evolution of the European legal frameworks, including the AI Act and the Digital Services Act, and how they can help address the use of generative AI for disinformation purposes. Noémie, looking forward to listening to your presentation. Over to you.
Hey, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I will now share my screen, so let me take a moment to do so. Here we are. I hope you can see the presentation, right?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, today I'll be talking about generative AI and disinformation from a legal perspective. And I would like to first thank you, Raquel, and the EU DisinfoLab very much for their invitation. So let's start with our agenda for today. So I will first briefly introduce you to my research center and provide some research acknowledgement that fueled in today's content for the seminar. I will then briefly explain what are we discussing when we are talking about generative AI, and then how it unfolds in a disinformation context. We will then pursue with the evolution of the EU legislative and policy landscape, and we will conclude with some ways forward. So let's start with CITIP. CITIP stands for the Leuven Center for IP and IT Law. So we are part of the Faculty of Law and Criminology of the University of Leuven. We have a staff of currently over 85 researchers specialized in legal and ethical aspects of IT innovation, intellectual property. So we focus on rethinking current existing legal frameworks necessitated by the rapid evolution of technology in various fields. So we are focusing on artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, data protection, privacy, e-health, pharma, ethics and law, intellectual property, media and telecommunication, and also cybersecurity. So we have different kind of tasks in our role at CITIP, and our research center has, of course, a first pillar, which is teaching. We have an LLM, so Advanced Master of Law in IP and ICT, where we provide key knowledge to students, scholars, but also practitioners, because there's a lot of people working that are also doing this master's. We also have a solid track record as a law and ethics partner in international and interdisciplinary research projects. And we also act as a service for experts, advisor to policymakers. For instance, one of our professors, Peggy Valk, was a part of the focus group on AI of the Council of Europe, but also an advisor to Commissioner Vera Jourova about the European Media Freedom Act. So this is what we do in our research center. And for today's presentation, the content comes from different items. Firstly, we finalized a project I will talk to you about now, which is very key for the topic of the day. Called the project is called AI4Media, where my colleague Lidia Dudkiewicz and I we conducted legal research for about 4 years. Based on this research, we also collaborated with another colleague at CITIP called Jean de Meyer on a forthcoming book chapter. And this is a bit the teasing area where a lot of content you will hear today will be part of an academic contribution, so a handbook on disinformation. And we wrote a chapter on generative AI and disinformation. So don't worry if you miss some information today. There will be, like normally, an academic publication soon. The chapter is currently under peer review, and there's also personal research and teaching activities which will fuel today's content. So a few words about AI4Media, because for me, today's seminar is a perfect opportunity to create awareness about the research, but also the outputs we created during this project. The project lasted 4 years, and we developed a Center of Excellence on AI in Media. The project aimed to ensure that European values of ethical and trustworthy AI were embedded in future AI deployments in the media sector. So the project is now finalized. As you can imagine, we have a lot of things to share, to disseminate, and to be used by the sector. So a lot of this is available on the project website under various formats, whether it would be reports, fact sheets, some videos, but also technology. So if you're interested, feel free to have a look at the website. I'm sure you will find interesting information there. Just a bit of information about who worked on the project, one of our really added value and key strength was the interdisciplinarity of the project. And we really found out during these 4 years how interdisciplinarity, discussion among different sectors, different disciplines were really key to ensure responsible technology development and deployment. So we had 30 leading partners, universities, research centers, but also industrial partners. In a nutshell, what did we do? We did some core research on technology, which were then embedded in real-world applications. We had 7 use cases during the project where the technology was tested out, and one of the use cases focused on disinformation. We also paid attention and closely monitored policy and regulatory developments in the EU about AI and disinformation. And the societal concerns were also a key part of the research. And we also invested energy in developing a collaborative PhD program, but also promote deeper and long-running interactions between academia and industry in order to build bridges, make information and knowledge circulate to design better technology. One of the use cases indeed focused on disinformation. So it was led by Deutsche Welle and ATC. So in their use case, they leverage AI technologies to improve support tools for journalists and fact checkers, for digital content verification and disinformation detection. So as you can see here on the image on the slides, these are all the different partners who had the technical expertise, who really brought their knowledge together in order to better improve the tools. These features and tools are made available within Truly Media. If you don't know Truly Media, it is a web-based platform for collaborative verification. So it's already an existing tool to help journalists. And AI4Media basically developed, refined, and provided new tools to this platform in that use case. And lastly, to conclude on AI4Media, and then we'll move on to the core aspect of today's seminar, I would like to introduce you to the AI Media Observatory, which is really the one-stop shop for AI in media research. And it's basically a knowledge platform where we have some content which is curated and monitored, part of the AI media feed. But there's also expert perspective on potentials and challenges that AI poses for the media sector. So it's in Let's Talk AI and Media, where we have different videos, where we have experts interviewed or existing seminars recorded that we can refer to. And then there is lastly an expert repository that allows stakeholders working in the field from different disciplines to get in touch with each other for collaboration, whether it would be publication, but also different projects. So this is my call for you. If you're working on the topic and that you have content that could be relevant for the mandate and the remit of the observatory, feel free to send it out. The aim of the observatory is to keep on going even after the project. So if you have a report or a publication that fits the observatory, please send it. We have an email address on the website. If you have event focusing on the topic of AI and disinformation, for instance, feel free to send it out as well. It's a good tool for further dissemination. And of course, if you wish to become part of our expert repository, we have a consent form at your disposal, so feel free to reach out. Let's now dive into the core topic, which is Gen AI and disinformation. So what are we talking about? When we talk about generative AI or AI, there's a lot of terminology coming in that adds a bit to the complexity of the field if we are not having a technical background. We hear about general purpose AI, foundational models, LLMs, chatbots, deepfakes, machine learning. And I just did a sort of visualization exercise to try to simplify things, or at least explain a little bit the terminology. I must put a disclaimer, I don't have a technical background, but just to simplify things, we have this family of artificial intelligence systems within which we have a sub-branch, which is general purpose AI, and then there's the model and the systems. And the model are basically trained on a large amount of data, and they are capable of completing different tasks regardless of the way the model is placed then, which is why it's named general purpose. And within this family, there's the generative AI applications, which can be or narrowly designed for specific purposes, or indeed designed on top of general purpose or foundational models. And these systems are typically used to create new content under different formats. And the content which is created thanks to generative AI can be called synthetic content. And within synthetic content, an example of this are deepfakes. I hope this helped to clarify. So indeed, generative AI can generate different type of content, text, voices, audio, video, images, but not only. It can also produce other type of content. There's different stages unfolding this. So there is the development stage where we have the data curation, the data selection, the training of the systems, and then the deployment. And also there's the prompt and the use aspect, which is very important in the Gen AI output kind of life cycles. So one important thing that we found out in our research is that we really need to demystify or debunk myths around generative AI. We found out that it was really important to clarify about the capabilities and the limitations of the model. Because Gen AI is technology based on mathematical and statistical theories. They predict responses and generate content according to the data they were trained on, the rules in place, the variable in place, but also the prompts. And they detect recurring patterns to reproduce content. And one of the risks we identified was AI anthropomorphism, because their capability to discuss and exchange, whether it would be through a chatbot, for instance, can be quite striking. And Gen AI does not know what it produces. It only finds patterns and correlations. And the risk with AI anthropomorphism, and anthropomorphism is the act of projecting human-like qualities or behavior, but to non-human entities. If we attribute human traits to AI, it can really skew our ethical evaluation of AI and affect our perception of the moral character, status, but also responsibilities and trustworthiness. And therefore kind of it elude or dismiss the human responsibilities, while for us in our research, we really found out it's extremely important to not dismiss or to not undermine the human role behind technology development, deployment, but also how technology is being used. These are a core component of the legal and ethical aspect. For instance, human influence have on which data are being selected, are the data diverse, what will be designed as the algorithm, what would be the safeguards in place, what are the rules or variables chosen, what are the limitations, the check and balances, what are the review mechanisms in place. These are all elements where human involvement and responsibilities are extremely important to design responsible generative AI tools or use, for instance. Indeed, Gen AI raises a lot of legal and ethical questions, and as you can imagine, we won't be able to cover everything today. We will really focus on the disinformation angle and how the legal framework has adapted and evolved. But of course, there's question of data protection, intellectual property, competition, and so forth. From the legal and ethical considerations we came across during our research, there was indeed, in relation to the media sector, a lot of fears around media independence, media freedoms, and the concentration of power, whether or not they should rely on external third party, whether that would be influencing their editorial safeguards or checks and balances, their liability. There's also the question around concentration of power, whether these generative AI systems or applications are gathering data online, including data from media without fair remuneration, people opting out, opting in for the trade, so the text data mining exemption, and all this discussion about the moral consideration, whether or not media content should be included to balance out the data that are used to train the model. And then there was all this question around the power dynamics around technology development, where we see now some licensing deals taking place between generative AI providers and media outlets or publishers. But usually it's the biggest one. And then there's the whole question of local media or media with less bargaining power. So these are all ethical aspects we found out during our research, quite striking. And one of them was the ability of generative AI to produce inaccurate information and be used as a tool for disinformation purposes. So, and this is what we'll be discussing now about how does this generative AI unfolds in a disinformation context. So with my colleague Lydia and Jean in our book chapter, we tried to look at things throughout the value chain creation of an output. So disinformation consideration comes at different stages. And it's interesting to study it this way because the actor's responsible person would be different, and there would be different obligations to the different stages. For instance, for input training, it's the same as for artificial intelligence. The quality of the output of the system would very much depend on the quality of the training data and the input data, so also known as garbage in, garbage out adage. Here in the disinformation context, there's a lot of discussion about if data are scraped from online and from the internet. There's, of course, very serious websites or blogs or media outlets websites, but there's also a lot of like complotist blogs, fake media websites with disinformation narratives. So how does the model make the distinction? How is the balance in the data training? There must be a lot of different things in there. So this influence, of course, what comes out after. So research has actually shown that AI sometimes misidentifies disinformation sites as legitimate, but it also shows that numerous AI-generated news sites operate with minimal human oversight and contain false news. So that also can be taken in the context and in the data used to train the model. So there's various legal and ethical considerations here about the quality of the content that's being fueled. And then about the prompts. We have seen how prompts and user prompts are influencing GenAI outputs because GenAI responds based on the specificity and formulation of user prompts, but also on the terms of services and their safeguards in place. And prompts can be used for very benign purposes, such as I'm looking for information, I would like to educate myself on a certain topic, I will ask questions, for instance, to the chatbot, but also mining purposes, how to create a disinformation campaign, how to be more convincing about a certain point of view, how to target my speech to a certain audience. And it all depends on the context and the intent, which is also very much, as you are familiar with disinformation. So these are also very much challenging aspects to regulate because it depends on a lot of different considerations. But for instance, when asked how to spread disinformation, ChatGPT, when it was tested, responded in a denial of reply, saying, I cannot assist you in this regard, and citing ethical harms related to disinformation. But if you twist slightly your prompt, how do disinformation campaign work? For instance, the system here would list an entire 16 steps how to have the best disinformation campaign, that you need to hire influencer, that you need to use this and that. So a single prompt just twisted slightly could have a very much different results, leading to a certain kind of prompt engineering, people learning how to use the system, how to have prompts that would go around the safeguards put in place. And there's been an audit conducted by NewsGuard where they tested 10 leading AI chatbots with disinformation prompts. And their finding was that around 32% of chatbot responses included disinformation narratives, and that there was, they highlighted the risk to have a forum shopping or among platforms with various restrictions for malicious use. And then, of course, the output can also be used as a disinformation support. The output depends on the quality of it, but now with generative AI, we see that, for instance, deepfakes are more and more credible or more hard to detect to the human eye, while before we had a lot of elements telling us, no, okay, I can spot it's a fake, there's like 5 fingers, like 6 or 7 fingers, sorry. But now text can be used, can just convey disinformation narratives. So in the output, because it has been trained on bad data or because of other aspects, so it can hallucinate, provide incorrect information, but also help to provide convincing text for disinformation narratives. And we have seen, all of us, some audiovisual based on generative AI application, and the degree varies a lot between high quality and low quality. But these are also a vector for disinformation. So in terms of the impact, there's a lot of things we don't know yet. The quality can very much depend, as I just said. But what we know is that Gen AI is really adding to the complexity of the information space. It's contributing to the already distrust climate, and also reinforces polarization or tensions because it contributes to the loss of traceability of sources. Some of the generative AI application provide sources, other not. So this is a moving target at the moment, and things are changing, but we see that they're not a uniform or unified approach towards the sources. In our research, we found out that it was extremely important to have a balanced approach about the risks, because sounding extremely catastrophic or exaggerating was extremely counterproductive, as well as downplaying the risks that would actually enable this and misinformation to unfold. So we need to be based on facts, on research, and much more needed to be done to assess the impact of Gen AI from a short, mid, and long-term perspective. How did the legal landscape evolved? Well, firstly, for disinformation, as you may know, it's a complex topic to regulate for different aspects. I might go quickly over this, but very much depends on the content, the context, the intent, the author. These are challenging aspects to regulate because we are flirting or touching sometimes freedom of expression, and it's hard to establish regulation without impacting too much freedom of expression, or having the risk to have the regulations used to censor or restrict freedom of expression, or having private entities or governments having the wielding power to determine what is truthful, Ministry of Truth, and so forth. And it can be also hard to allocate different responsibilities. What we have now is the revised code of practice. So we have self-regulation, but we also have regulation that do help to target the issue of disinformation, such as the DSA. I will talk later on about this as well. The regulation on transparency and targeting of political advertising. In the DSA, there's the introduction of a co-regulatory mechanism, which is basically tying up the self-regulation with hardcore regulation. But there's also media literacy initiatives and guidelines that are being unfolded. When it comes to the AI regulation, well, there's one thing that happens when we are coming across a new technology or something new. There's the dimension to always, we need to adopt regulation. But the first thing to do from a legal and policy perspective is to look at the existing rules. Because it's not because AI and generative AI are new on the market that there's not already an entire corpus of legislation which is applicable. So the first thing is to look at the existing rules, whether or not they're still fit for purpose, that they are like meeting the expectations, enabling to have a solid framework to address the challenges raised by the new technology. If not, the first thing is to also update the existing rules. If updating the rules is not enough, then adopting an entire new legal framework or new rules are necessary, and that's what happened with the AI Act. And another approach could be to let the sector self-regulate or adopt non-policy instruments. And what happened with the European Union, we saw in our research during the project, is that it used a bit of all the different approaches. It relies, of course, on existing rules such as GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, but also fundamental rights instruments. Also comes and revised some of the text. This is the case for the Safety and Safety Directive, but also adopt a new legal framework with the AI Act, and also rely on the sector to self-regulate. We have the EU AI Pact, which has been launched this summer. So it's the pact is basically a voluntary pledge for participating companies to commit to at least 3 core actions: AI governance strategy, high-risk AI system mapping, and promoting AI literacy. There's also all the standardization that will come for the implementation of the AI Act. So we see here a mix and match of different policy and legal approaches. When it comes to Gen AI and disinformation, here is a sort of visualization. I just have to put some disclaimers. Today we'll focus on a selection of various relevant instruments because we don't have too much time. Of course, much more would be relevant as well, but these are the ones we studied in our research. And of course, even in these instruments, more provisions could be useful, but we decided to focus on these ones. And these instruments are extremely interesting because they complement each other. And the purpose of the legislator was to have them not contradict each other. So they refer to each other a lot, which is quite interesting in terms of legal synergies. And so we have the AI Act. And for generative AI, for instance, content, manipulated content or generated content, transparency provisions, which are actually helping for their identification, which is supporting the Digital Services Act, where intermediary services providers also have some rules there to identify the content. We have the revised Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is complementing the DSA as well, and the guidelines. And we will see that now. So firstly, what is already in place and in force? We have the revised Code of Practice on disinformation. So the code is voluntary, it's an engagement from their signatories. And here in Commitment 5, it deals specifically for transparency application, where signatories actually have to report on their practices and policies related to AI-generated and manipulated content, and to respect rules unfolding from the legislation, including the AI Act. So there are transparency obligations mirrored by the AI Act. And here we have a great fact sheet and report and investigation, which was conducted by our host today, by Raquel, which actually this report highlighted that while platforms the report focused on selection of major online platforms, they took effort to address this commitment by adopting and adapting their policies when it comes to Gen AI. These efforts for the moment still remain marginal and do not address all forms of AI-generated and misinformation, such as textual content. So in addition, the social media platforms studied and analyzed also do not have a unified approach when it comes to AI-generated and manipulated content. There's much more findings in this report, so that I will warmly recommend you to read. But so we see how things are still not fully harmonized in the way platforms are dealing with this. The code is very much linked to the DSA. So the DSA is an extremely important piece of legislation. It acts as the lex generalis for the EU content moderation regulatory landscape, and it's an asymmetric regulation. Basically, it imposes due diligence obligations on different type of providers that you can see here. So we have the bigger family of intermediary services providers, and depending on which category you are in, you'll have more obligation applying to you and your services. So when it comes to AI used in the media sector by these platforms, it's actually one of the first instruments clearly putting things in black and white in the legislation. So there's actually a lot of rules mentioning AI or automated tools. They speak about content moderation, recommender systems, and there's a very important provision on data access. And there's also within the legislation this co-regulatory mechanism where it allows the European Commission to scrutinize very large online platforms and very large online search engines compliance with certain code of conduct, and their compliance with the code can actually influence the assessment whether or not they really are mitigating the systemic risk unfolding from their services. And the mitigation and the assessment of the systemic risk is really one of the cornerstone of the DSA. And there the develops and developers have to conduct this assessment. And the DSA is listing part of potential mitigation measures that they can adopt. And one of them is specifically focusing on the use of generative AI to disseminate disinformation. So one of the measure is about producing distinguishable information for generative AI content with prominent markings. But it focuses on information that resembles existing persons, objects, places, or events that appear authentic, but they do not include text. And that's one of the loophole from the wording. And that can explain as well, because at the time where the DSA was adopted, ChatGPT had not been, or it was more or less at the same time, it was November 2022. So it explains, and perhaps in further revision, this will be corrected or clarified. But at that time here, it's not mentioned in the text. But if we take the purpose and the meaning of the legislation, it will be interpreted as having text as well. And there's also some power granted for the European Commission to have some investigation requests for information, which happens specifically on the topic of generative AI. So the EC lodged some information requests to some of the flops, and what they adopted as mitigation measures in March and May. So all of this in the context of the EU election. And EU election, and here we can also mention an important instrument, which is the guidelines. However, these guidelines are non-binding. So this is one of the policy instruments used by the EU to focus on Gen AI, where they suggested measure for disinformation risk reduction, which include indeed suggestion and encouragement for these platforms, very large online platforms and search engine, to take Gen AI risk into consideration in their risk assessment, in their mitigation measures, and they even list some of the mitigation measures, such as indeed for the detection, ensuring the consistency and robustness of the model, updating their terms and conditions, labeling, especially when it's used for ads. So this is also a relevant document. The only thing was that the timing was actually a bit bad. I think it was released in April 24, very shortly before the elections. So the platforms had very limited time to implement those. And there was a stress test that was conducted with these platforms and the European Commission, but the results have been not disclosed. So I don't know much more about this, but I guess we'll know more in the future about this aspect too. And then lastly, the AI Act. So it's a very key regulation. that was adopted in July 24 and will be fully applicable as of August 2026. However, some of the obligations, similarly to the DSA, will be applicable sooner in February 2025. And for more information, it's in Article 113 of the AI Act. So it's an internal market instrument focusing on two main category of actors: providers and deployers. And the distinction is very important because they do not have the same obligations. It's a bit in a similar fashion as the GDPR, where we have the controller and the processor. Here as well, we have two different types of categories of obligations. So we have the providers that are the ones developing AI and the one placing it on the market or putting into service under their own name and trademark. And then the deployers, which are the one using the AI system under their authority. And an important aspect is that there is a household exemption, meaning that does not fall in the scope of the legislation, AI used for personal reasons, actually. So there's really this dimension of internal market. How does this look like? We have the risk-based approach, so where we have different type of rules depending on under which category of risk is the AI systems unfolding. But because it's very hard and unlikely to determine the risk of general purpose AI, because they can be used for a wide range of sector or functionality, there has been the adoption of specific rules related to general purpose AI, meaning transparency rules, but also additional rules in case the systems are considered as being entailing systemic risk. And this aspect has really triggered a lot of debates during the trilogue, during the negotiation of the file, because it's extremely sensitive and it came up after the proposal had been released. But once the proposal had been released, there was all these general purpose AI tools, applications such as ChatGPT, DALL-E unfolding, and it was not foreseen initially in the proposal. So these rules have been added after. So is disinformation in the scope of the AI Act? Well, not per se. However, the AI Act specifically acknowledges the potential of AI to further increase the impact of the problem. That's part of different recitals. And it provides important information. There's no definition per se of generative AI, but there is of AI systems, general purpose AI model, general purpose AI systems, and also a definition on deepfakes. So what happens according to the risk-based approach? Well, deepfakes and generated content has been categorized as limited risk, triggering only transparency obligations. So basically providers, they need to make sure that the outputs are marked in machine-readable format. So it enables the identification. So they must be detectable unless it's only for an assistive function or for standard editing, and it does not substantially alter the input data. So the identification can be done by a various way: watermarks, metadata identification, cryptographic methods, proving the provenance and the authenticity of the content. The idea is really to facilitate content moderation, and there is a clear link made with the DSA implementation, including for very large online platforms to identify systemic risks with generated and manipulated content being present in their services. And then there's also obligation on deployers, or the one using. So if there's deepfakes, there must be a disclosure about their artificial nature, unless this is part of an evident artistic, satirical, or creative piece. And there it does not require descriptive disclosure. It's not that it doesn't have to be disclosed, but it doesn't have to be all the time during the movie, oh, this is made with deepfakes and so forth. And then there is a very interesting article. I think that this one in the context of disinformation is extremely important. This article about AI-generated text on matter of public interest. And there the disclosure is eluded, so there's an exception. If the content has gone under human review or editorial control by an identifiable person or organization. So here in a disinformation context, we've researched a lot on this, and it appears that this exception creates a lot of uncertainties. So it will be up to the regulator to assess if it has been subject to editorial control, which is a highly difficult task to do. What constitutes a human review? Who can be said to hold editorial responsibility? What is a media, for instance? So in a media and disinformation context, research showed that people actually want media companies to lead by example and therefore not benefit from the exception. And there's a great deal of interest in the industry to label, mark content to prove their provenance, authentify the content, and how it was generated. So this is a bit strange from our research and perspective. And also, we really see how here the AI Act is really protecting the audience. And I know time is running, so I will be short because it's actually one of my
Sorry to
slides.
cut you off, but I would like to leave some time for the Q&A.
Yes.
So if you could finish, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries. So indeed, and there was also some transparency obligation for general purpose models and systemic risk, because they can indeed, because of their wide-ranging application, they need to provide more information, and there must be mitigation measure put in place. And here as well, disinformation is mentioned as one of the potential systemic risks. So we see here how the AI Act can actually really be used to be one of the tools of the legal arsenal. So ways forward. Digital literacy is key, and we really need to invest in research. So GenAI is an additional tool for disinformation campaign. The legal framework has provided some solution, but now it's really time to focus on the enforcement, on the implementation, make use of all these new provisions, whether it would be the data access, the labeling. We need to watch if these are currently correctly implemented, if it's actually providing and making a change in practice to fight disinformation. If not, we need to criticize, publish opinion piece to really pinpoint this one to improve further revisions of all the systems. If you're further interested in how the AI Act and the DSA meet or not media needs, we have drafted a series of blog posts where we contacted media stakeholders and other type of stakeholders, and where we comment on this aspect as well. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry for the length.
Thank you so much, Noémie, for sharing with us this very round and holistic overview on such a complex topic. And by the way, thank you as well for the mention to our report on AI policies. It's time to start the Q&A session. As a reminder, please use the QR code to join Slido or type slido.com #disinfo. We have around 10 minutes for questions. I have a question to start, but I will give first a bit of a space to the audience. Marie Bonner, thank you for your question, is asking about the regulations. Do the regulations mention anything about the use of media data in AI and generative AI training? And furthermore, on the financial compensation of it?
Very good question. And indeed, there is now, so I mentioned these additional rules on general purpose AI, where the providers need to convey transparent information about what data were used for the training. And they will have to mention whether they used or not media data. So on the one hand, it will be helpful for media companies to know whether or not their content has been used. And this will probably also lead to more licensing deals, if they want to use the content, because they have now to disclose if they used or not the content. This will be a leverage power for media companies as well to be included in the training model. But the financial compensation of it, there's no information about this, but there's mention of the intellectual property aspects in the training data. So that is one aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Another very interesting question is our second one. Should or could there be a global treaty on AI use? Do regional regulations work if people can access AIs in other jurisdictions that are not being regulated?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good question. Well, a global treaty on AI, it's not global, but there's the Council of Europe Convention on AI. So there's as well a new instrument, which is way broader. So the Council of Europe, I think it's 47 member states, so it's way larger than the EU. But for sure, this is something that can be thought about. And for instance, what I know from my expertise and my research on the EU aspects, the territorial scope is really broad. So it's even if you're not based in the EU, but you're offering like the models or wanting to place the product on the market, you will be under the regulation. So they really tried, a bit like the GDPR, to have a broad territorial scope to cover as much possible. So that maybe have also repercussion, like we saw with the GDPR, where it had different repercussion globally, worldwide. So that might happen as well here with the AI Act, where a lot of people are watching what's happening in the EU and how the regulation will be adopted and be implemented.
Yeah, some way we can be a kind of inspiration for other regions. I'm going to take advantage of my role as moderator because I have a question about the different laws you mentioned, the AI Act and the Digital Services Act. I'm very curious about the overlaps between them.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, the AI Act applies to AI providers and deployers, while the DSA applies to platforms. But what happens when social media platforms integrate generative AI features, thus behaving like AI providers? And vice versa, what happens when AI companies start to integrate search features like OpenAI has just done? Could this affect the status of OpenAI as just a provider and making it appear as a search engine, and this way falling within the scope of the DSA? So would this kind of tech developments trigger overlapping obligations under both laws?
It's a very, very good question. And indeed, this is something that needs a case-by-case analysis. So indeed, more and more technology evolves, more the delimitation between the different legislation will actually be a bit blur, and some very large online platforms could actually be considered providers under the AI Act. It's not exclusive. They can be actually both because it's different kind of legislation focusing on different kind of aspects. So these digital players may well fall in one or two or both. And it really depends on what happens. For instance, more and more a deployer actually provides data to the provider, asking him to design the AI systems to reflect their needs. But can they therefore be considered a deployer or a provider? The line is not so, the line is actually thin. And it really depends what is the involvement. If you start designing from scratch, then actually you're not a deployer anymore, but you will be a provider. And things can very much change depending on what features are added to the social media platforms, for instance. I know that Snapchat has Snapchat My AI, but it's in the remit of interpersonal communication. And that is not in the scope of the DSA, because the DSA is like for online platforms, so public communication. So here as well, we have another layer of complexity, but indeed, it really depends on a case-per-case analysis, but it might well be that in the future, because they start using and developing themselves, they might be very well falling under the scope of both legislation and will have to abide by both type and set of rules.
So we can expect an evolution here,
yes,
constant evolution.
Yeah.
We have another question that is very recurrent in our webinars on AI. What's your take on labeling AI content to address the problem?
No, it's a very good question. And I think it helps, but it does not solve the entire issue. And when we think about, for instance, deepfake, for instance, most of the deepfakes are not disinformation. They are like non-consensual, sexually explicit and intimate deepfake. And here, disclosure of the manipulation of the content has no, is not the solution. It's still harmful to see the content, whether or not it's true or false. In a disinformation context, there has been research showing that even though there's a mention of the manipulation of the content, if people are believed before seeing the content, it confirms their belief, and that therefore they don't pay attention to the labeling. So there, I mean, I am not researching per se on this, but I know a lot of people are researching on this. I think it's extremely debatable whether or not it's efficient to use transparency and labeling to be, okay, this is the solution, and now we're covered. I think we really need more than that. It's part of the solution, but for some audience, for instance, it might be counterproductive because they are so in their beliefs and in this confirming worldview that it will not make a difference. So that is really part of the solution, but really not the entire solution.
And regarding the accountability, should AI providers be accountable for Gen AI disinformation at the same level as platforms for their distribution? What's your take on accountability?
That's also a very ethical consideration, but it really depends what is the use of it, because what they claim to offer is a system for people to use. It's not like a website with authoritative information. They do mention when you start using the system that the system might hallucinate, that you need to cross-check your information. These are small boxes that you just need to pass before entering the interface, so nobody really pay attention to them. They just pass the information. But what they say is indeed that the system is not perfect, so they cannot bear accountability. It's a way for them not to bear accountability, and it really depends who is using the system. If it's a journalist using the system to write a piece of information, the liability will be on the journalist and the information that it will put after he needs to check sources, make sure that what he meant is what is meant by the chatbot that helps to support, for instance, to write so I think the liability question is open. There's a lot of discussion. There's also now a legislation being negotiated at the moment about AI liability. So I think their part of the liability question will be held there, but still for people using it for instance, scholar articles, of course, they remain responsible for their article, and they need to check and make sure that they agree with what is written as a support with the AI tools.
Okay, so we have a last question to be answered in 1 minute, if it's possible. You already mentioned the European Commission guidelines for the mitigation of systemic risk for electoral processes, and one attendee is asking if they were and how were finally implemented.
Yes, so I don't have much information on this, unfortunately. There was a stress test conducted with the EC and the platforms, but I didn't see these results disclosed. And as I mentioned, indeed, they were released extremely short before the election. So the timing was extremely short for the platforms to implement. So I really don't know much about how this unfolded. I hope to get more information from the EC through a report or transparency or evaluation of the DSA kind of. Let's see.
Thank you so much, Noémie, for your insights. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time. I hope our audience has enjoyed and learned a lot, which is something we would love to hear about. You will be kindly requested to fill in a rating survey after the webinar ends, where you can also suggest future topics to be covered in our sessions. And before wrapping up, let me advance our next webinars. Next Thursday, we will speak about Latvian resilience to disinformation with Dr. Richard Bambals from the State Chancellery in Latvia. And on the 28th, Chinese FIMI during Taiwanese elections will be the topic with Ben Graham-Jones. We hope to keep seeing you around, and also a quick reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available shortly on our YouTube channel, where you can also catch up with the previous ones. Thank you again, Noémie. Thanks to Maria and Quinton, our support behind the scenes, and thanks to everyone who attended. Have a good rest of the day and see you very soon.